And hello, colleagues. And I'm really delighted to have this opportunity today to speak with you about what I think is actually one of the most important problems in distance education today, and that is the problem of student dropout. I've actually been working in distance education for around 40 years, far too long really. And I've visited more than a dozen or so countries to talk about student dropout. I've written a book really about student support and how we can use it to affect student dropout. And I have a website where there's a lot of articles and presentations and so on, which are freely available. Now, I've been concerned about student dropout, well, for as long as I've been in distance education. I think the problem's often ignored because of people's fascination with technology. So let me start by asking a few questions about student dropout to help us understand it. Most important question, of course, is how many students drop out? Secondly, who are they? And interestingly, when do they drop out is important too. Another question that I think is equally important is, what are the actual consequences of dropping out, both for students and for the institutions they leave? And of course, the obvious question of why do students drop out of distance education, and what can we do about it? But let's get an idea of the sort of scale of dropout. I think there's many ways of assessing student dropout in distance education, but I think the simplest and overall method is to look at graduation rates. The thing is, the benefits of education depend largely on being able to graduate, and I think that's the most important measure. So here are some comparative graduation rates for various institutions. I've put full-time institutions in blue. So the UK full-time dropout rate is the retention rate is about 82%. So roughly 18% of UK full-time students on graduation. Part-time students don't do as well in the UK. Their graduation rate is only 39%. University is of particular interest because it presents identical courses in two different ways. The full-time face-to-face has a 61.5% graduation rate, whereas the part-time distance version has only a 15.7 graduation rate. I think of the difference between these two as the distance education deficit. You can see that my old institution, the Open University, only has a 22% graduation rate. In fact, that is now a rather old figure from several years ago. The graduation rate since has actually dropped to 13%. And here are some other graduation rates for various distance institutions. Not many distance institutions publish their graduation rates, I think for obvious reasons. Some are even worse than I've got down here. The University of Phoenix from America, which is now beginning to invade Europe, has a graduation rate of only 4%. So the UK is actually a very good example of finding out about dropout because it does keep really good data. This graph cumulative graduation rates at the UK Open University since it started in 1971. Because the education is part-time, it can take up to 12 years for students to graduate, so you have to look at a cumulative graduation rate. And you can see that that accumulative graduation rate has actually been dropping ever since 1971, right down now to that 22 or now 13% for more recent graduates. At the beginning of the OU, there was a cohort of very well qualified undergraduates coming in, mostly teachers who were looking to get degrees. That might explain the very good results the OU got in its first few years. But since the 1980s, that cohort has largely vanished, so this more recent drop is still unexplained. If we show these results on a bar chart, it'll give a better idea of just exactly where we are, and you can see that the graduation rate decline has been pretty precipitous. We have to hope that this doesn't go on too far. My second question is, well, let's have a look. Who drops out? Well, a few years ago, myself and a colleague in OU undertook a statistical survey of new students coming into the OU. And we were able to develop a statistical program through a binary regression analysis that was able to predict a predicted probability of success for every new OU student coming in, which depended on their various characteristics. You can see that the prediction varies from around 11% right up to around 80% for a group of students who entered the OU a few years ago. But how is this prediction generated? Well, what we did was look at something we called the predictive coefficient. This coefficient shows the most important factors in determining whether students are going to drop out or not. You can see from here that the most important factor in determining whether a student's going to drop out is that they were on the wrong course for themselves. The second and almost equally important predictor of dropout was that they had a low level of previous education. After that, the factors became less important, whether they were from an ethnic minority, whether they were in a manual occupation, whether they were male, and whether they were particularly young or particularly old. You can see that I shouldn't really be registering for a distance education course myself from this data. That was very important in giving us a handle on the sort of things that we might do to ensure better student retention. But let me go on and look at the important question of when students drop out. What I'd like you to do now is to think of students as salmon swimming up a precipitous river in order to get to the headwaters and success and spawning, although we won't go into the spawning bit, I guess. This diagram is something that illustrates that. It's a kind of rivergram, I call it. The width of this rivergram is proportional to the number of students entering distance education on this particular Open University module a couple of years ago. Students enter the module and they proceed upstream. And at the very first assignment, a large number of them, nearly 40%, disappear off down the exit channel. They're washed away out of the system. A similar number, or few, drop out at every subsequent assignment, but as you can see, the biggest dropout is right at the very beginning, the very first time students have to interact properly with the system. I have to say at some point that some distance educators really aren't worried about dropout. I came across a quote the other day from someone saying that high program dropout rates may not be a bad thing for distance education. After all, he said, the expense to students and society is minimal. Actually, I profoundly disagree with that comment, because there's evidence that dropout actually damages people. Because my fourth question is, what are the consequences of dropping out? First of all, what are the consequences for students? This diagram is based on some work in UK full-time higher education, so I can't guarantee it applies to distance education, but it illustrates the probability of students dropping out, suffering various things such as depression, unemployment, and for women experiencing violence from their partners according to their education level. And what it shows is that, starting from a probability of 1, that people who don't actually enter education at all and people who successfully get through higher education all have a lower probability than people who drop out of education of experiencing depression, unemployment, and so on. So dropping out appears to actually damage people, and the costs of depression, the costs of unemployment in any society are huge. In the case of the UK, possibly billions of pounds every year. So there's some significant problems for students who drop out. As I say, we don't know if that applies to distance education students. I have searched for studies that look at the effects of dropping out of distance education, but I've never found any yet. And given that so many students apparently do drop out, that's rather strange. It's an area that we really should be investigating. But of course, the other issue is that there are consequences for institutions. For instance, there's the possible reputational damage to institutions when it's discovered that their dropout rates are so high. The biggest will be a loss of institutional income. If you're losing half your students or more in your very first year, then you're losing a great deal of income in the second year. You may also be losing government support. And last year, I visited the Open University of the Netherlands, who are having quite a difficult time because the government has spotted that their dropout rates are very high and has been asking whether they should continue to support the Open University there. Well, we're moving on to my next and very important question, of course, which is, why do students drop out? Well, there's quite a lot of different ways of finding out. As I say, we've looked at the statistics of dropout using our predictive model, and we've also used questionnaires with students. We've even used focus groups at some point to try and determine how people or why people drop out. Questionnaires are useful, but the problem is that sometimes they give you too much data. This is a copy of part of the withdrawal questionnaire that the UK Open University uses. Every year this is sent out to the students who withdraw, and it asks about 50 or so questions. Now, one of the problems of such a survey is actually too much data. This is a summary of the returns of the one particular questionnaire, and as you can see, the number of reasons that students give is really enormous. This goes on, whoops, sorry, stay back there. In fact, when you look at the details, students often give more than one response to a questionnaire, and so you end up, in this case, with something like 27,000 reasons for dropout from 7,000 people responding. The difficulty is actually making sense of it. But when we try to make sense of it, there are two things that emerge. There's two particular reasons that seem to emerge more importantly than others. One is that students are on the wrong course. That agrees with our statistical model, where we found that students being on the wrong course for themselves is one of the most important reasons or factors in predicting dropout. The other reason that students often give is that they were running out of time. Now, running out of time or getting behind or having insufficient time to do the course is obviously a very important issue. But I think that actually running out of time is not solely a question of work and family and other pressures. That's not to say that work, family, and other pressures aren't extremely important. But a student who is well motivated to keep going will often be able to overcome those time pressures, and much more so than a student who is losing the motivation to learn. This is certainly the view of the late Professor Edward Anderson. Edward Anderson wrote that the best predictor of student retention is motivation. Retention services need to clarify and build on motivation and address motivation reducing issues. Most students drop out because of reduced motivation. I felt when I heard this that that was instinctively right, having come across all kinds of students who face similar difficulties, some of whom dropped out, but some of whom were able to keep going. The difference did appear to be their level of learning motivation. But how do you actually deal with learning motivation? Well, Anderson said something else that also struck me as really quite important. He said that student self-referral does not work as a mode of promoting persistence. That was in America. So if I translate that to English, what he means is that if you want to increase retention, you must reach out to students. He also said, and this certainly struck a note with me, that students who need help the most refer themselves the least. In other words, students who need the help the most actually make the least effort to obtain it. In other words, as he says, effective retention strategies take the initiative in timely interventions, in outreach and timely interventions. In other words, it's no use waiting for students to contact us. We must take the initiative to reach out to them. So there are two things that we must do if we're interested in keeping students going. One is that we must ensure students are on the right course. And the second is that we must reach out to them proactively. Well, okay. So far, so good. A few years ago, I came across the work of another American researcher, a Dr. Alan Seidman. Now, Dr. Seidman is editor of the Journal of College Student Retention in the US, and he had a formula for student retention. He said that retention was just a question of early identification of your vulnerable students, and then early, intensive, and continuous intervention with them. Now, my background actually is in theoretical physics many years ago, a subject which in those days was a great turn-off at undergraduate parties. If I said I was a theoretical physicist, the girls would sort of edge away from me. Now, thanks to the efforts of Professor Brian Cox and other people, I gather it's become quite a sexy subject. Much too late for me, sadly. But the thing is that I really rather like formulas. I like the kind of clarity that formulas can bring to particular situations. So I took Dr. Seidman's formula and I amended it a little bit. And this is now what I like to think of as the Simpson-Seidman formula for student retention. I'm hoping that one day it'll be as famous E equals MC squared. Then again, perhaps not. At any rate, my formula says that retention is a function of the following factors: appropriate course choice for students, the early identification of vulnerable students, and then early and continuous proactive and motivational support. I've also added one more term, which is external support, which I'll come to in a moment. So let me deal with that very first item, appropriate course choice, because I suspect that sometimes we don't put really quite enough effort into helping students get on exactly the right course for themselves. In the OU a few years ago, we experimented with various methods of getting people onto the right course for them. We developed something we called taster packs. A taster pack is just designed to give students a short sample or taste of a particular course, a kind of test drive of a course before they actually start out on it. A taster pack contained a sample of the course content, the assignments in the course, and then very importantly, a specimen assignment with a tutor's comments on it. Students told us that this was the most interesting part of the pack. And we were concerned that showing students a bit of the course might actually deter them. But what we found was that students said to us, I can see the course is going to be difficult now, but at least I now understand the level of the challenge. It's the fear of unknown that's the most off-putting thing, isn't it? The other thing we developed were students' reviews. That's the taster pack. And these are the students' reviews. This was a kind of, well, I suppose, a sort of TripAdvisor for courses. It was a website where students who'd actually taken a course could leave a comment for the students who were thinking of taking that course. For instance, this is a comment on one of the UK Open University's Spanish courses. And the comment says that actually it is more difficult than the course description suggests, although the course books are good, and you need to make sure that you have the right level of Spanish before you start the course. Coming from a student, I think that kind of advice is rather more likely to be accepted than just coming from the faculty itself. The third thing we did was to develop diagnostic quizzes. These were self-assessed quizzes that students could take before they started the course in order to see whether they had the right background for the course. That's fairly easy to do for subjects that are very course specific, like maths, science and technology. It's much harder to do that for subjects like humanities and social sciences. So we used our predictive model to see if we could devise a kind of generic diagnostic quiz. And what we did was to take our findings from our predictive model and put them in a questionnaire that students could take on their own and discover just how good their chances of passing were. So the idea was to ask very simple questions like, are you male or female? If you were male, you'd subtract 5 from your starting score. How old are you? If you were under 30, you'd subtract 13. If you were above 30, no change, and so on and so forth. So you'd end up with a score out of 100. And the score would tell them their chance of success. So for instance, at 100 or above, you'd have a 70% chance of success. That was very good news. You will still be a challenge, but with hard work and effort, you should be able to make progress. Rather more difficult was the advice to students with a low chance of success. What we said to them was, well, okay, at the moment your chance of success may be rather low, but you can improve that chance. You might not want to change sex, from being a man to a woman. But you could, for instance, take a simpler course to start, or a course at a lower level, or you could take some other alternative qualification before starting. I have to admit that I didn't actually ever pilot this particular questionnaire. I retired from the Open University before being able to do so. But recently I was contacted by a colleague at the University of South Africa who'd used a very similar diagnostic quiz with his students, and he told them the results. What he found, very interestingly, was that they actually did better as a result. I think that's an interesting, really interesting finding, and I'd love to know more about why that happened. The next term in my formula is that early and continuous proactive motivational support. In other words, taking the initiative to contact individual students interactively and as early as possible. It has to be early because, as my ribogram illustrated, most student dropout occurs very early on in the course. It must be proactive, as Anderson says, because, as the researcher Dr. Bogdan Eaton said, we must reach a quiet student. And it should be motivational in some way, because, as Anderson says, students drop out through the loss of motivation. Learning motivation is a big subject, and I'm learning about it very slowly. I've put a podcast on my website about what do we know about motivating students to learn. And there's an article there as well about do we need a theory of student support about motivation. But I've a lot more to learn about learning motivation. And if anyone out there almost certainly knows a lot more than I do, I'd love to hear from you and find out what you know about motivation as well. My final term is one that I suppose I came across by accident in a way. Oh, sorry. Before that, I should say that there is evidence for proactive support increasing retention. People have used a variety of media, all the way from postcards in Norway right the way up to emails and phone calls. And as you can see, there's reasonable evidence that they can cause good increases in student retention. You'll notice too that I've commented that some of these projects are actually cost effective. I'll come back to what I mean by that in a moment. My last term is external support. This may seem a rather curious item to put in here, but a few years ago, a colleague and myself did a survey asking students where their most important support to keep them going came from. The answers shouldn't have surprised us, but they did a bit, because they said the most important support they ever got was from their families and friends. Yes, there was important support from their tutors as well, but there was equally important support from other students. There was important support often from their employers. And it turned out that support from the institution itself directly was actually one of the least important forms of support. That set me thinking. I thought, my gosh, are we missing something here? So I persuaded the university to set up a website for the friends and families of Open University students. This is the website at the moment. It's very simple. All it does is try to help families and friends support their students most effectively. It explains what's going to happen to their students when they need the support the most, such as when assignments and exams are coming up, and how the little things that support students can help. Babysitting, taking the children out, allowing quiet time, and so on and so forth. I don't know how effective this is. It's very hard to gather evidence on this. The other form of support was from other students. We set up another project. We called it Find a Study Friend. It was a kind of study dating process. It was a website where a student could go in, they could say what kind of study friend they wanted, what course they wanted, the age, the sex, and so on. And then they could link up with someone who'd also asked for a study friend of the same kind. I'd love to have piloted this, but unfortunately, at this point, I retired from the OU, and unless you're actually right there to push these things through, they tend not to happen. So I'll never know whether this would have worked or not. But one form of student-student support that I do know worked was student mentoring. While I was working in New Zealand, I conducted an international research project on student mentoring. By this I mean students who've completed a course, helping students who are just about to take that course. We found a very substantial increase in retention of 35% over students who were not mentored. It was a fairly small group of students, this, but I think the results were pretty significant, and I would love to have seen the project taken further forward. Well, to finish my presentation then, I'd like to go back a little and ask again why students drop out, because there is one more factor that affects students drop out. An old colleague of mine from Scotland, Veronique Johnston, says that the biggest reason for student dropout in an institution is actually the institution itself. What does she actually mean by this? Well, there are several reasons, I think. One, of course, is poor course design. I think there's a lot more that could be done to make distance courses more motivational. I've put a podcast together on that called Distance Course Design for Retention, but I've a lot more to learn about what makes an effective, retention-friendly, motivating distance course. But another factor I think is very important is what I think of as institutional attitudes. Sometimes you can come across people in distance institutions and in conventional institutions who say, well, part of my job is to weed out the unfit students. I think of them as the Darwinistas of distance education. And that can have a really substantial effect on their attitude to students and how far they're prepared to go to help them. Veronique Johnston and I have written an article about that, which again is on my website. And again, if anyone's interested in looking more closely at these attitudes, there's even a questionnaire on my website that will enable you to decide whether your institution is a Darwinista institution. The third and most potent argument for institutions affecting student dropout is that there's insufficient funding for it. Time and again, when you put up a proposal to increase student support, you will be told, we just don't have enough money for that. But there can be. Again, I've written a paper on the cost benefits of student retention policies and practices, which is on my website. But let me explain how it works. It's kind of straightforward, really. If you put money into student support and that increases student retention, then you get more students carrying on the following year, so you get an increased student fee income, which you can feed back into student support. In other words, the lesson is that if you want to increase student retention, you need to invest. For instance, the article I've written on the website shows that making proactive contact with students, which increases retention in the UK Open University, can have a return on investment of more than 300%. In other words, you get back 3 times as much in increased student fee income as you actually spend on the project itself. So, there we have it. The Simpson-Seidman formula for retention. But it may be even simpler than I'm saying. A few years ago, when I was working in New Zealand, I was at a meeting of the Polytechnic's academic board, and there were some student representatives there. And I asked one of them, what would you say is the single most important thing that has kept you going during your studies? And he thought for a moment and he said, well, if a tutor phones me, I love them already. And for me, I think that kind of sums it all up, really. If you make individual proactive contact with your students in some way, then that's the key to keeping them on board, keeping them going, and improving your student retention. As I say, there's other articles and things on my website, but let me stop there and allow a bit of time for any questions and comments you may have. Thanks very much.